Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is Game 12 from the 2012 Fide World Chess Championship match. Going into this round, both players remain level at 5.5 points each, and Anand on the white end in this game opens with e4, and we follow the first 4 moves of Game 10 of this match. So we're once again seeing Gelfand's c5, Anand replying knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the Rossolimo. After e6, bishop takes knight, pawn on b recaptures, and now here's where things change on this move 5. In game 10, we saw b3 and Gelfand's interesting and effective e5 advance, where Anand ends up grabbing that pawn. Gelfand follows up with this series of forcing moves, regains that pawn, and also forces a queen exchange and is able to hold a draw. Things are different. It's not b3, but rather d3 in this game 12. Reinforcing e4 does not permit e5 because now it could just be taken successfully. So the adjustment, the follow-up, is knight e7, which is a bit of a curious move, the most natural being f6, so why not go there? Well, what is it that white wants to do? White wants to play e5, so let's stay out of the way of e5 with tempo. Additionally, if you can't stop e5, well, let's try and show that it's maybe overextended. Knight on e7 is a step in that direction where it's looking to play to g6 and do just that, apply pressure to the white pawn on e5. So as a follow-up, we have b3, and it's important to not just get caught up with the thought of, well, you do b3 to fianchetto the bishop. No, view it as b2 or a3, because in several lines, it is this c5 pawn which could turn out to be a great target. Whether or not the pawn plays to d6 or d5, initially, when I was reviewing for this game, I was thinking that, well, the c5 pawn could really turn out to be a target if this pawn decides to go to d5 but not d6. That's not the case, because if this pawn is playing to d6, there's always these e5 moves to undermine this pawn, and sure enough, it is once again c5 that could turn out to be a target. This is actually the move that is played. It is d6 that is played at this moment, this move 6. And it is e5 that is the response by Anand. And it is important to get this e5 move in right now. If you go with the routine, we have not only this bishop biting on a rock, but this queen bishop now is free to have an influence on the position. You can view this e5 move, this move 7 that was played in the game, as doing a couple things. Messing with this structure for sure, queenside structure for black, and the queen bishop. What is its future? If black is not aware of this, it could turn out to be a dead piece. It's certainly not coming out in this direction anytime soon, for as long as there's a pawn on e6. The c6 move, or c6 pawn, is not moving anytime soon, so there's no future here. And if you play to a6, well, it's not too exciting there either. You're kind of biting on a rock in that line as well. So black needs to be cautious. In many lines, this guy could turn out to be a dead piece, that queenside bishop. So we have knight g6 at this moment. This right here, instead of knight g6 move, this is the first instance where black can actually grab on e5, and white cannot capture right away. If takes and recapture, queen d4, contrary to a line that I had showed in game 10, queen d4 actually is a very good move here. This is a winning move for black. In that other line, there was from that game 10 that I highlighted, the d pawn was still on d2, the knight was still on its home square, and there was a clever response in that line from game 10 that I showed. Not the case here. Or in other words, after you take, you can't recapture. So let me run with a line such as castle. How exactly to show compensation for being down a pawn as white? So let's look at some natural moves such as castle, and let's say black eventually does something like this to maintain the pawn. Eventually there's ways to put pressure on it. Black will have to run with f6 at some point to secure e5. Let's say it's just done right away. After knight on b to d2, now there's an interesting question that's placed to this knight. What are you going to do? You have 3 options, and there's drawbacks with each. If you play to g6, the first thing to note is you're a little bit off sides, and it may turn out that this pawn just drops and there's really not a whole lot you can do about it. And this pawn is still weak. This bishop is still not playing a great role in the position. How might that spring about? Knight e4, bishop e3 or a3, queen e1 to c3 or e3. In short, these three pieces can organize themselves in a way to grab that c5 pawn if the knight's playing to g6. If the knight plays to f5, once again we could be seeing a knight to e4 move, and it turns out to be a bit more of a reliable home. Since there is a knight on f5, the knight is not going to be kicked with f5. And we could still see something like bishop a3, maybe queen e1, c3, something like this. Maybe even just having the knight and bishop converging on c5 could turn out to be a bit awkward for black to defend. Maybe there isn't even the need for the queen to immediately go ahead and grab on c5. The compensation is once again seen, in short, on white's pressure on the c5 pawn. The last one is knight d5, and maybe this is the one that's not so clear, because the bishop coming out to e3, of course, it could be directly captured. If it's trying to put pressure on c5, it could be immediately captured. And if it comes out to a3, it could kind of be shut out with something like knight to b4. So what could follow, instead of maybe trying to put pressure on c5, is something like knight h4, which is allowing for queen to h5, which is inducing maybe some weaknesses against the black king. Again, in short, it's not, white cannot get that pawn back by force, but things are difficult for black. If this pawn is having to move to stop queen h5, or the king is having to go uncastled or something like that, it's just very, very difficult. It's not so smooth for black in all of these lines. So we don't have that. We don't have black capturing on e5 at this moment. This is the first option that black has to do that. They don't go for it. Instead, put pressure on e5. And now h4. If black is not careful, this pawn could turn out to be a giant thorn. Don't get into the habit of thinking it doesn't matter how to capture on e5. It does matter. Don't flip a coin and decide which piece to grab on e5 here. You take with the pawn, I think you're dead. There's not some forcing line I could show to checkmate, of course, but it's just h5. The knight gets kicked back. h6. If you're allowing a pawn to get this deep in your own territory, you're really asking for trouble, because it's already compromised on the queen side with regard to your structure. And now there's a compromised king side structure. The question now is, what is this king going to do to get safe? Where is his safe home? There's no safe home for this king because this pawn is now on h6. Something to certainly avoid. Don't allow this pawn to get so deep in the black position. So we don't have pawn takes, but rather knight takes on e5. Knight recaptures, pawn recaptures, and now black is up a pawn, but there's a positional compensation. The knight playing to b2 observes the c4 square, the e4 square. There are still possibilities for maybe pinpointing the c5 pawn. But an interesting decision by black at this point is to run with the c4 move. And I believe it's played for a couple of reasons. Both of these, well, one of these bishops at least, is increasing in mobility. Of course, the bishop now has, with this c4 move, the bishop has the b4 square available to it. As a follow-up, the knight recaptures, and we see immediately that the bishop is now in a spot to exchange itself off for the knight. It's important for black to not just get caught up in, well, I have the bishop pair, I want to hang on to the bishop pair, because, well, really, what's the life of this guy? Again, it's kind of a dead piece. And black is addressing it in an interesting way with this c4 advance, giving that pawn right back, freeing up the bishops in some way. The knight is the one that recaptures. There's no need to capture with either pawn, keep the structure as is. And now the knight has pressure on the pawn, not really threatening to grab that pawn, because there still is these queen d4 moves available. But instead, it's bishop a6, pressure on the knight, and now queen f3, pressure on c6. Black is meeting this with a line that allows for white to get a pawn back, queen d5. And she's really well placed in the center. If there is a queen exchange, the pawns are repaired, but this pawn would fall, and that's what we see going on in this game. There was an interesting, another interesting move to sidestep the queen exchange, allow for bishop takes knight, pawn takes, and queen d4, and this could really turn out to be messy here. The rook being hit, rook b1, it is on open file, but now after a queen check, can't block with the bishop because you're dropping c2, so there would be white now going uncastled in what is likely to turn out to be a decisive game if you're seeing a king going uncastled and the queen still being on the board here. It may seem not very good for white, but there's still some problems even for the black king. Even though black still has the opportunity to castle, how do you castle? As soon as you move this bishop, you'd be dropping g7. So it's not so clear how white organizes, or excuse me, black organizes things and how white would go about things here. We don't enter that. Both queens are really being disruptive to one another in this particular line. We don't have that. Anand instead goes for a line that wins a pawn, but allows for black to have activity for the bishops and pressure against the white queen side. Queen takes, pawn on c recaptures, opening up the c file to eventually put pressure on white's c pawn. The knight takes on e, and now the knight gets kicked around a little bit, f6. The king is making way for a home on f7. With the queens off the board, there is no castling going on for black. There's no need to castle, keep the king closer to the center. So after the knight comes back, we do have expansion in the center, rules out knight d4 moves. A nice center here by black, controlling a lot of squares. This knight does not have the greatest home on f3. It's out and about, but this structure alone is negating its presence. So white castles, black castling, well, not castling, but castling artificially, knight, king f7, and again, staying closer to the center of the board. He's maybe looking to get to e6 one day, and ideally he wants to be on a light square opposite the remaining bishop for white. As a follow-up, c4, striking at the center in some way, trying to make this structure flinch. And now more development on the black side, bishop e7, bishop e3 for white. Bishop b7 doing a couple things, maybe preparing, well, I don't know about captures and then bishop takes knight, because I think the resulting structure 3 versus 1 is perfect. So it's more of a clearance for the black a pawn. Bishop's coming back so that this guy, sort of a minority attack, can be employed. So now we have a capture in the center, and the bishop's recapturing a really strong piece, bearing down on this knight, but also this queenside structure for white. Still this a4, a5 idea, and this bishop in many lines can be putting then direct pressure on the white a2 pawn. So a very strong piece is this light square bishop right now. After rook on f to c1, I always wonder which rook to go here. I think it's better to go with the f rook so that if the king needs to help out, he's in a spot to do just that in a couple moves. In the meantime, a5, following through with this a4 idea. The bishop now comes to c5, a typical idea. If your opponent has the bishop pair, try and get rid of that one bishop. Rook on h to d8, and it's preparing to just put pressure on the weak link right here, the weak pawn for white, the guy on d3. After bishop takes bishop, a draw was offered by Anand, and it was accepted by Gelfand. Why was it accepted? Well, I mean, white is up a pawn. If play had continued from here, this is the last move that was played. They agree to a draw right here, and if play continued, we would have, of course, the recapture, and now the threat being by black to grab the knight and then grab this pawn. If it's defended with, let's say, rook c3, what might we have? We could have, let's say, the bishop backing up, looking to put pressure on this pawn a bit more, or even something like, you know, forget bishop f7, something like maybe rook to c8. If the rook's double, something like this could come about, where there's a4, and this structure once again is getting broken down. There could also be maybe, I'm not saying that these are best lines, I'm just trying to show how black can still be putting pressure on the white side. Even though white is up a pawn, it's very difficult to get it rolling and pose any serious threat. Instead of, let's say, rook c3, if there's knight here, now we could have, let's say, a bishop backing up, a rook defending, maybe even the bishop putting pressure on the pawn like this. If the knight is trying to block like that, it could be taken, and then there's rook activity, rook to maybe go to the second rank, etc. In short, no matter how you slice it, even though white is up a pawn, black is able to maintain pressure, but the decision by Anand was to really just offer the draw and take this World Chess Championship match into tie breaks, a series of 4 games with time controls 25 minutes with a 10-second increment, and that right there is unprecedented in World Chess Championship history, where it goes down to tie breaks. So we will see what happens in that group of 4 games. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.